So my name is Fiza Qureshi. I'm the CEO of the Migrants' Rights Network, and we've partnered up with MEND. We are invited MEND to join us, so really thankful for Lindsay for partnering with us on this event. And the reason why we have created a series event called it's part of a series of events, I should say, called Who is Welcome, and looking at the intersection of immigration with other kind of issues and identities. And one of the key reasons why this series kind of came about was around the differential treatment for Ukrainian refugees. And so we started to look at kind of how race and racism interplays with refugee policies. And we can see, and we will talk a bit later about how it manifests itself. And part of that conversation, we really wanted Islamophobia to also be kind of a topic, but we were unfortunate that the speaker was unavailable. So we thought, right, let's hold this separately as an event, and kind of get MEND's expertise around this issue as well, with all their work on Islamophobia, and see what conversations we can have, and kind of hopefully raise awareness around how Islamophobia does manifest itself within immigration policies. I also have a vested interest, I guess, because I am a Muslim. I'm a second generation migrant, and with the recent Nationality and Borders Act, I can have my citizenship deprived of without notice. And I know I can always be deprived of citizenship, sadly, in this country. I'm not British enough. But the fact that kind of piece of legislation coming through really awakened people to realize that actually this is a very real threat to a lot of people, and unfortunately particularly Muslims, as the Institute of Race Relations kind of highlighted recently with their report. I've also sadly experienced, not directly but indirectly, Islamophobia within the immigration migrant refugee sector, and that was in relation to kind of the May 2017 tragedy bombing in Manchester. And there was an immigration communication group for the sector, who immediately kind of sent around an email and said, we're gathering the Muslim organisations in Manchester and the migrant refugee organisations in Manchester ready to say, ready to reflect on what's happened and, you know, offer apologies, etc. And by that point, they were asking us at a point when the police had already said, don't speculate, don't assume, I don't have any idea of or the identity of the person who's committed this atrocity. And so I challenged this. I just said, why are we preempting what's happening here, and asking people to apologize for something that they're not responsible for? And sadly, it was met with, well, it's likely to be Muslim because of the method at which this bombing has happened. It's a suicide bombing, so it's going to be a Muslim, and therefore, you know, we need people to speak out. What I did ask them was to reflect and say, well, if this is possibly a far-right fascist that's committed this atrocity, have you got all those organisations lined up to speak about, to apologise on their behalf? And obviously that was met with silence. So it's really a kind of an emerging issue within the migrant refugee sector around how misunderstood Islamophobia is and how it manifests itself. So that's from me, and I hope we're going to have a further discussion around, you know, around this issue. And I'm really excited to hear from Waqas and Isobel today around this topic. But firstly, I'm going to hand over to Lindsay so that she can introduce herself and MEND.
Thank you so much. So my name's Lindsay Taylor. I am the regional manager for Scotland for MEND, but also the Deputy Head of Community Engagement and Development for MEND UK-wide as well. MEND is a not-for-profit organisation that works to tackle Islamophobia across the board. It works at grassroots level all the way through to political level, and it's about encouraging Muslim communities to engage with politics, media and civic society, but also for media, politics and civic society to engage with Muslim communities, because often we see that this doesn't happen, and that's really important, that there is that two-way engagement going on, because it takes two sides to have a conversation. So we're delighted to be here this evening, because actually Islamophobia is often one of these topics which isn't discussed within this sphere, as it is often not discussed in many other spheres. So we are really delighted to be here and have this conversation this evening. Now, we have some guests who we're delighted to have with us. And our first guest, who's going to talk on the subject and really kind of lay the setting stones for our discussion this evening, is Isobel Ingham-Barrow. Isobel is the CEO and founder of Community Policy Forum, an independent think tank seeking to engage academics, policymakers and community groups to creating evidence-based and community-centric approaches to policy making surrounding the challenges and structural inequalities facing Muslim communities in the UK. She's also studying her PhD right now, and her PhD research is at the University of Exeter, where she's exploring the impact of Islamophobia on British Muslims. But before I hand over to Isobel, I want to just highlight that some of the topics that we will be talking about this evening can be quite triggering. So please just bear that in mind. And if you do need a little time out and a little breather from the discussion, we do completely understand. There is obviously also organisations there to support for anyone who is a victim of Islamophobia, including the Islamophobia Response Unit, which are there to support victims. There are also other organisations across the UK that offer similar support. So I just want to kind of make people aware of that and make people aware that these topics can be really triggering. So if I can pass over to Isobel, please welcome and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
There we are. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much to Lindsay and Faiza for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak on something that I think is a very, very important and understood area. And what I really want to touch upon is how in the UK, many of our laws, policies and practices surrounding immigration are unavoidably created, maintained and informed by the war on terror. So what I really want to focus on is this kind of intersection between the war on terror, immigration and Islamophobia, and how it's all inextricably interlinked. And to start with, I think we have to understand what we mean by the term xenophobia. Now, xenophobia is quite an often used term, and it usually means, people tend to use it in terms of a fear of foreigners, a fear of people that are foreign, but that's not exactly what it means. When we're talking about xenophobia, we're actually talking about fear of anything or prejudice against anything that seems foreign, but that seems different to the dominant cultural, religious, political, ethnic status quo, right? So outside of the dominant group. And what that means is in the UK, for Muslims, quite often they can be considered foreign, regardless of whether they have been born in the UK, regardless how long they have been here, on the fact that it is largely culture, religion, practice, behavior, and all these different types of things that are seen to be outside of the dominant norm. And the war on terror really has, it's based on a cultural project wherein a perception has been created where Muslims are framed as fundamentally in conflict with the West in terms of practices, beliefs, behaviors, values, and identities. And within that, there is then this perception of threat that is created, that Muslims are seen as a threat to Western identity, security, and way of life. And this obviously has impacts for Muslims both in the UK and around the world. So firstly, you can't really, just as an example, you can't really appreciate the UK's laws on, say, citizenship stripping without understanding how it's tied to the war on terror and the structural Islamophobia that it promotes and maintains. So as a starting point, and I should caveat, the government doesn't actually release any data on or any official figures on citizenship stripping. But according to FOIs and various research that's been done, it appears that prior to 2006, there had not been a single case of citizenship stripping since 1973. Now, then between 2006 and 2010, obviously, as the war on terror began to gain momentum, we saw about 9 cases. Then suddenly, in 2017, that number peaked at 148 cases. So we've gone from 0 in what, 30 years, to 9 in a period of 5 years, and then to 148 in a single year. And then in between 2018 and 2020, there was at least 197 cases. So we've seen a huge exponential leap in the number of citizenship stripping cases. And to understand where that leap has come from, the key point is the 2014 Immigration Act. Now, the 2014 Immigration Act came about as Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, her response to the 2013 case of Halal al-Jeddah. Now, Halal al-Jeddah had come to the UK as a refugee from Iraq in, I think it was 1992. He then got his British citizenship in 2000, which meant that his Iraqi citizenship was rescinded. So his British citizenship was the only citizenship he had. So because of his activity in Syria, when the Home Office tried to strip him of his citizenship, the Supreme Court declared that it was illegal because you are not allowed to make someone stateless, even though the government said that he could apply to have his Iraqi citizenship reinstated. That led to the 2014 Immigration Act, which basically allows the Home Secretary to rescind someone's citizenship if they believe it is conducive to the public good, and if they believe that it is possible for someone to get a citizenship elsewhere. So they don't have to have it. So that is what led to the case of obviously Shamima Begum. And in her case, she had never been to Bangladesh, but because her parents were born there, it was seen that she could apply, even though Bangladesh obviously turned around and said, no, we're not going to give it to her. And she was made stateless. And that's obviously a huge dilemma, because firstly, you've got a political figure. Don't forget that the Home Secretary is not a judicial figure. He is, or he or she is a political representative of a political party with a political agenda. Being able to activate that executive power. Also, there are problems with the fact that there is very, very little judicial oversight. In many of these cases, you're seeing things like secret evidence, people not being able to view the evidence that is being used against them. And obviously, if you can't see it, you can't combat it, you can't fight against it. And it creates a whole swathe of second-class citizenship in the UK, where someone like myself, for example, I could never have any access to another citizenship, but anyone whose parents were perhaps born in another country, that would mean that their citizenship is constantly going to have that potential to have it taken away. Even if it is incredibly unlikely that that would happen in reality, it is still that potential that it could happen, and it does happen. And it adds on to that perception that no matter how long Muslims have been here, whether they've been born here, whether they've come from somewhere else, there's always that kind of label that they are seen as guests in the country because of that precarious citizenship status. And then obviously the Nationality and Borders Act that many people are aware of quite recently expanded it so that, expanded the powers so that it can be taken away without notice. It increased the Home Office's kind of categories in which they are allowed to not give notice. And obviously, if you're not given notice, again, you can't fight it. And it extends beyond just specifically immigration and citizenship policies. It also expands to all our discussions around human rights, for example. So as many of you may be aware, the Human Rights Act has been under attack for a number of years and has actually been described as a villain's charter that only protects terrorists, criminals, and immigrants, and gives people unnecessary rights and protects them at the expense of the supposed deserving public. Now, that has led to the government tabling the Bill of Rights, which is currently being shelved. So it was originally tabled, it was up for debate, and it has now kind of been pulled back, and we're not sure what's happening with it. But it could come back at any moment, and it likely will come back in the near future. But the government's main arguments for overhauling the Human Rights Act and putting forward this Bill of Rights is a very, very heavy focus on removing executive barriers to deportations. And we saw all the rhetoric surrounding the Rwanda flight and, commentary about the European Convention of Human Rights and our human rights framework in the UK. So this is all under threat because of this attitude towards immigration. Then we have to look at how Muslims are treated if they are not born in the UK. So if this is what Muslims are experiencing in the UK, what is it like for people who are trying to enter the country? Well, the war on terror has dehumanized Muslims and presented them as such a threat that they are seldom seen as worthy of protection. And it doesn't take much to see this. And actually, I've got a personal story for you. So in 2011, I was actually living in Syria. And when it became too dangerous for me to stay, I and all my friends from different UK universities there, we all received emails from the Foreign Office saying that it was too dangerous to stay, and we had days to leave the country because it was too dangerous. And it was heavily advised that we left because it was too dangerous. So when I get back to the UK, we all remember the rhetoric surrounding Syrian refugees and how unwelcome they were. And at the end of the day, you're looking at your passport and I'm thinking, well, if it's too dangerous for me to stay, why is it not too dangerous for Syrians to stay? We're telling them to go back, And so there is a real sense of who gets protection and who doesn't. And specifically because Syrians are Muslim, Iraqis are Muslim, there is this added layer of a perception of threat and not being entitled to the protections and to the same kind of standards of Western values that we supposedly protect and promote. And you can see this through the images. I mean, the very famous one was Nigel Farage's advert on the run up to during the Brexit campaign of this so-called invasion of brown men, particularly supposedly infiltrating our country and being a threat to our women, and all those kind of awful narratives that surrounded Brexit. And the fact is that even when Muslims do support the UK's interest, the Western interest, and a good example of this is Afghanistan, when people were actually helping Western forces, even that is not enough to make them become regarded as equal. They are still considered outsiders. And obviously, a year ago, when the UK and the US withdrew from Afghanistan, not only were staff who had assisted, they were not protected. And not only were they not protected, and many of them were left in Afghanistan despite the danger. We even have reports of embassies leaving paperwork with their personal details left all over just strewn all over offices for the Taliban to find. And people are still in hiding because despite them supporting the Western efforts in the war on terror, they were still considered outsiders and not equal of protection. And then we can compare this to how other populations are treated. So, for example, in Afghanistan, a year ago, the UK government made a commitment to resettle. I think the commitment was around about 20,000 Afghans. Now, only a handful again, there is not a great deal of accurate data on this, but it appears that only a handful have actually been resettled in that time. But when we compare that to the treatment of Ukrainian refugees, obviously, remember I said a commitment of 20,000 Afghans. With Ukraine, by the 28th of June, it appears that 86,600 had actually entered the country. So that's more than 4 times the amount that was committed for Afghan. Now, that disparity is also highlighted there was a recent YouGov poll to show support, I'm just going to pull it up, to show support of refugees coming from different areas. And while 71% of the UK supports Ukrainian refugees, only 50% support Afghan, 45% support Syrian, and 40% support Somali. So you can see there's a clear distinction between where refugees are coming from and whether they are seen as worthy of protection in this country. So, and obviously, we already know that Muslims born in the UK are facing challenges with in terms of Islamophobia. then that is going to be compounded for refugees that are coming here from other countries. They're obviously going to face barriers on multiple levels. You know, all refugees face challenges in terms of language. Usually they are economically disadvantaged. There are issues with healthcare, all these different things. But that is then compounded by Islamophobia. And not just Islamophobia in terms of hate crime and harassment on the streets, we're also talking about employment discrimination, and we're also talking about structural Islamophobia. And just as the one example of citizenship that I mentioned before, the fact that someone's status is never going to be as completely secure as it is for other people. And as I say, statistically, the probability of someone having their citizenship stripped is incredibly low, but it's not non-existent. And the fact is that because it can be applied to certain people in a way that it cannot be applied to others, and the fact that because it, as I say, it comes through the person of the Home Secretary, it is an inherently political act. And that is why this is we cannot separate immigration policy from the war on terror and the political climate in which we live, and the treatment of Muslims and the way they are framed within our current socio-political and public discourse. So I'm gonna stop it there, because as you can probably tell, I'm quite likely to go off on a rant for quite some time, but I hope that's helpful. And if anyone's got any questions, I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Isobel. And I have known Isobel for a number of years, and there is not a single time where I don't have conversation or hear her speaking at an event where I do not learn so much more about the topic. And this is an area that I work in. And so yes, thank you so much for that. But we do have time just for a couple of questions. I know that was a lot of information, so we wanted to make sure that people did have time for a few questions after each section, but you will also have time for the end. So if anyone has a question just now, please either raise your hand or unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat. It's entirely up to yourself. But while we're waiting for that, I wanted to highlight something in your speech here, Isobel. You highlighted the fact that you could probably never have your citizenship stripped because of your status within the country. And what I realised recently is, being married to an Ivorian man, I automatically have a right to apply for Ivorian citizenship. So actually, as somebody who can trace my family back generations and generations in the UK, I've realised that from marrying somebody else from Ivory Coast, I have now become in that position where I could actually have my citizenship stripped in a way that I couldn't have had before, which is very concerning to me.
And actually, that's not an aspect that I'd thought about before, that, you know, marriage and how citizenship can be applied that way. But yeah, exactly. So even if you don't think you're vulnerable, you could actually be vulnerable.
No, definitely. No, if we don't have any questions, then that's great. Oh, yeah, please.
Well, I mean, I hope Waqas isn't going to touch on this subject, but I wondered, Isobel, if you could talk a bit more about the refugees that were kind of interned and held in Belmarsh, and then all the agreements that were put in place with the countries that they had sought refuge from. Because I thought, you know, reflecting, you realise, wait a second, where was the refugee sector? Where was the migrant sector? Kind of talking about how refugees can be so easily stripped of their status because they have this label of terrorist added to them by, again, you know, a very political act. But yeah, and you know, if you've got any kind of comments on that, it'd be really helpful to hear.
Not specifically about people that have been kind of kept in these centres, but what I can say is that, again, because there is no real judicial scrutiny of these powers, because it does come through the power of the Home Secretary, and because there is still, you're able, or rather the government is able to use these executive powers in addition to things like secret evidence, as I already mentioned, that makes it incredibly difficult to fight these cases. And if you're a refugee and if you are in one of these centres, you're already struggling with access to legal representation. You're probably already struggling with access, with language barriers. And then on top of that, trying to navigate the UK's legal system, which is all stacked against you. And even if you use that legal system, because you're probably going to be looking at appeals to the Supreme Court. And if you've already been deported, say to Rwanda or something like that, you're going to find it very, very difficult to challenge those decisions. So if you are in one of those centres, there's going to be additional barriers to being able to fight this.
Thank you so much for that, Isobel. I was doing a conference over in, well, actually it was a Zoom conference, and it was an international conference some time ago, and we had similar actions happening during the conference, and my simple remarks were, thank you so much for carrying out these actions in the middle of the conference, because it really shows the issues around Islamophobia and the fact that when we are trying to raise these issues and topics in any kind of setting, we quite often have things happen because people are trying to distract from the conversation, which is really needed. So thank you for making our point here about the need to talk about Islamophobia on this platform. And now I will pass over to my co-host, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much, Isobel.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Isobel. And yes, apologies again. We don't actually know what happened there, but they are gone, hopefully. So next, I want to welcome Waqas Tufail, or Dr. Tufail, I should say, the Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the School of Social Sciences at Leeds Beckett University. But also, importantly, he's an activist and a community organiser and a co-founder of the Northern Police Monitoring Project. So he's got that kind of grassroots activity and engagement, and he's very engaged in kind of monitoring the police harassment, brutality and racism, and his activism kind of very much informs his work, and we're very excited to hear from you today. Thank you, Waqas.
Thank you, Fiza. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's nice to meet you all. It was really interesting just to hear the earlier speakers as well. And yeah, just thanks again for the opportunity to speak this evening. So yeah, a lot of ground has been covered, and I think it's always important to make sure that you don't want to go back over the same ground, although I think that there will be some overlap inevitably. I think it's maybe best just to kind of focus on perhaps an area in which I've carried out quite a lot of research, which is around the racialization of child sexual abuse and around the racialization of sexual abuse more generally. And I think that it's important to understand that much of the perceived threat in much of the media discourse and much of the political discourse perceives Muslims as dangerous in various ways. I mean, so for one, as extremists and terrorists, and this is well established, but then also perhaps this is kind of less evident at times, but as sexual threats, right? So the idea here is that there's an issue in terms of demographic replacement, so this kind of fits into the white narrative, those white supremacist narratives around great replacement. And those narratives have been directly influential in some of the worst massacres against Muslims in recent years. So if you think about Christchurch, the Christchurch massacre, that individual was very much influenced and cited great replacement theories. He actually made reference to the events in Rotherham, to the child sexual abuse in Rotherham in his manifesto, and he actually wrote the words for Rotherham on his ammunition as he was carrying out that massacre. So I think it's really important to kind of highlight how much of this narrative is kind of built upon the idea around that great replacement theory. And something else that I think we should highlight, because we've spoken a lot about the UK, is that this phenomenon is certainly not isolated to the UK. It's certainly not isolated just to a few countries in Europe. I mean, if you think about Islamophobia, and if you think about the fear, and if you think about how Islamophobia is enacted at borders in Europe, this runs to many, many countries, right? In fact, it would be a much shorter list of countries that don't have policies and that don't have a media landscape where Muslim immigration is demonized, as threatening in one of these ways. So I think it's really important to establish that. And I think something that I'm really interested in as well is who is participating in this, right? Which because it's not just a case of a law is passed and then that law is enacted by practitioners and by police officers, etc. I think it's much more complex than that, and I think that there's many more actors involved, who, it's fair to say, have an agenda, right? So one example, I think, is to look at the role of think tanks, right? So particularly in the role of migration, we have a number of well-established think tanks over the years, whose entire purpose, whose entire existence, is to whip up fear around minorities, is to whip up fear about the impact of immigration, and it's the campaign using huge amounts of funding that they receive, and often the funding that they receive is very opaque. It's difficult to kind of nail down who actually funds them. And actually it's very similar when we look at some of the main funders of Islamophobia. I know that some individuals here may have done, I know that Isobel may have been involved in some research in the past which looks at think tanks. I've written myself about the landscape of Islamophobia and think tanks, particularly Quilliam. So the Quilliam Foundation, which thankfully is now defunct, it kind of collapsed a year or two ago. In some mystery, to be honest, it was quite sudden what happened, but I like to say that I played a small part in that, given my research with Ella Cockburn as well, which kind of highlighted how their absolutely shocking report, which was shameful that it was published, but it was also shameful that it was uncritically reproduced by most of our media, and how they argue that 84% of grooming gangs in the UK are Asian, right? So this statistic was entirely made up. It was based on no clear evidence based. They just cherry-picked cases from the media. It was the worst example of research that you could find. And actually what's interesting as well is that we've learned that they've since pulled it from the internet, so you can't find it on Quilliam's website anymore. They've actually pulled it from the internet as well. But this is important to highlight, because what this did is that it really kind of helped to fuel a moral panic around dangerous and sexually violent Muslim men. I mean, so firstly, it's important to point out that Muslims sometimes do very bad things, right? They sometimes carry out acts of violence, they sometimes carry out acts of murder, etc., etc. And that's certainly been the case in many of these instances, right, where there's some serious abuse that has taken place. It needs to be investigated, and there needs to be consequences, and there needs to be justice for the survivors, right? So I think all of that needs to be said. And I think how this links to what's happening in wider Europe is that we see similar moral panics, similar racialized moral panics in many other countries. So even in countries as small as Finland, even other countries in the Nordic area, where there's been similar localized moral panics around Muslim so-called rape gangs, right? This phrase grooming gangs has become very popular in the UK, but it's certainly not isolated to the UK. Previously, historically, in France as well, and there's also some really interesting research which looks at Australia and how there's been similar localized racialized moral panics. And the point is not to kind of minimize or dismiss these events that have taken place, but the point is to argue that these events have been explained and represented through those individuals' Muslimness, right? And in this sense, whole communities have been blamed and stigmatized and demonized because of the actions of a few. And all of this does absolutely nothing for the prevention of sexual violence. And this is also one really key point that I make and that I make in my joint research with Ella Cockburn. And if anyone's interested, you can read our article in Race and Class, which kind of goes through this in much detail, and it's available open access as well, so you don't have to have a university subscription. So just a bit of a plug there. If you're interested in learning more about all of this, then please do have a look at that. In terms of what's happening in wider Europe as well, there was the incident in Cologne as well, and this was kind of real fodder for the far right, in how this was represented and again presented as a way to make the wider public believe that it's also a sexual threat. Okay, so just kind of going back to that narrative. Just one really important concept as well that I want to highlight at this stage is some really quite useful work by Sarah Faris. So she kind of devised this concept of femo-nationalism, and what she argued there, because sometimes we argue and we believe that these narratives emerge only from the worst excesses of the press, or that they emerge only from the likes of Nigel Farage and the more extreme far right. But actually, we need to look at the role of liberals, right, and liberal elites in how these narratives have been cemented, right? And quite often, it's white middle-class liberal feminists who are also quite instrumental in terms of campaigns to ban the veil, campaigns against Muslim immigration. So feminists and liberals are often at the front of this, right? And actually, this is where I think there is a real focus on the power of liberal Islamophobia, which often, is much more destructive than the far right can, because the far right are not in power, right? The far right do not have access to the same kind of resources to cause harm than the state does, right? And quite often it's the liberal state and it's actors within the liberal state who are enacting this violence. So I've got just a quote here. So this concept of feminine nationalism. So Faris argues that the so-called concerns of the far right and conservatives overlap with those of some liberal elites and some feminists. And this is most readily seen in debates on Muslim women wearing face veils, the perceived threat of Muslim immigration, and concern over the Muslim birth rate, right? So we have to kind of be absolutely clear here that this is also one of the key aspects and one of the key issues behind the great replacement theory, in that Muslims have this kind of exponential birth rate, and that if mass immigration was allowed for Muslim countries in particular, then this would mean demographic replacements and whites becoming a minority, right? So Faris argues that feminine nationalism thus describes, on the one hand, the attempts of Western European right-wing parties and neoliberals to advance xenophobic and racist politics through the touting of gender equality, while on the other hand, it captures the involvement of various well-known and quite visible feminists and femocrats in the current framing of Islam as a quintessentially misogynistic religion and culture. And others have also written on this and made quite similar points. So the work of Gargi Bhattacharya is quite useful here, and she describes how this kind of myth around the Black rapist has shifted in recent years, and now is very much cemented and fixated upon the brown man, who seem to be addicted to honor killing and violence against women. So this kind of notion of fundamentalism goes beyond simple extremism, but also goes into the kind of realm of gender oppression and patriarchy, and the Muslim man is kind of seen to represent the most extreme version of that. Yeah, I mean, I could certainly talk more as well. Have I got a couple more minutes, or is that all right? Yeah.
Go for it, Waqas. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So just to give one more example, I'm not sure if I can show the image because I'm not the best at Zoom, but this is an image that I use for my students, and I show this in class, and it's a front page of a conservative magazine in Poland from around 4 or 5 years ago. And the title of this magazine and the headline is "The Islamic Rape of Europe." And it's a figure of a blonde woman screaming, and she's dressed in an EU flag. She's a white blonde lady, and lots of brown hands are trying to grab her, and they're trying to rip off the EU flag that is represented as her dress, right? So I think this is a really quite stunning image of both racism, anti-immigration, and also just blatant Islamophobia, right? But this kind of speaks to the heart of those anti-Muslim narratives and attitudes that are really quite strengthening and have been strengthening over a number of years, particularly in countries like Hungary, like Poland, and other parts of Europe, but in the UK as well. And this is often ignored, right? And I think it's also quite minimized at times in the UK as well, because we see that some of the more obvious excesses in terms of state violence and state persecution of Muslim minorities, but it's absolutely central to what's happening over here as well. Just kind of one more thing that I want to add as well. I think that the work of Aaron Kanani is really quite useful here in terms of dispelling some of the myths around asylum seekers, and I'm sure that all of us are familiar here with the reality of what asylum seekers actually go through, the amount of money they do, or more accurately don't get, how little they live on, how they rely on the absolute bare minimum to get by. But I think that one underlooked feature is that quite often And this is deliberate policy, argues Aaron Kandani, where asylum seekers are funneled into already deprived white working class estates in the UK, where they then face quite often extreme levels of racism and Islamophobia. And there's been various incidents. I mean, I remember a Syrian family being firebombed in Liverpool not too long ago. And I think that this is something else that we have to question and perhaps try and encourage wider knowledge about, because people don't know that this is deliberate government policy. And this was very similar actually to what was happening with some of the early immigration in the 1950s and 60s from the former empire countries, so Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, where communities were deliberately housed together in some of the worst estates that were completely run down, rat infested, and they were segregated, right? But that was by policy and that was by design. And then decades later, we have a racialized moral panic that these communities are segregating. Well, that was your policy, right? You put us there, you put our families there. And now decades later, you complain about the lack of integration and self-segregation. So I think that we have to try and unpick some of these narratives that have become entrenched. And sorry if I've drifted away a bit from the focus of this conversation. I hope I made some useful points there, but I'll be more than happy to answer some questions that the audience have.
That's great, Waqas. Thank you so much. And no, I don't think you drifted off. I was, kind of intrigued as in terms of like when you talk about ghettoization, and I used to live in Newham, which is like one of the most diverse boroughs of London, maybe anywhere in the UK. And I didn't understand, well, how is it that all these other communities can live together, but white communities have an issue, white British, I should say, because the Eastern Europeans were all living together, Indians, etc. So no, I don't think you've veered off. I think it's a really important thing to discuss in terms of immigration and so-called integration and inclusion kind of like discussions. I wanted to so offer anyone who wants to ask a question or Waqas specifically, but again, we're going to now move on to kind of otherwise we will move straight into the panel discussion, if that's okay, and then Izzy and Waqas, you both have an opportunity. If anyone again wants to speak, wants to ask a question, please indicate by raising your hand, or do drop it in the chat. But what we would also like to do is, if anyone wants to come forward, again, if you feel safe to do so, and we can stop recording if you wanted to share any lived experience of Islamophobia and immigration, that's something that we would welcome as well. And again, you could always put it in the chat function instead if you felt you didn't want to come and say verbalize it. So I haven't got anyone putting their hands up. I think everyone's been quite shy, which is fine.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Okay, from Anna, thank you. So Waqas, she said she's found it really powerful what you said about how liberal Islamophobia is a lot more dangerous than the far right Islamophobia, and that's a really interesting point that I had not really considered before tonight as well. And so she wondered to what extent this is true, partially because of the fact it's more covert, less obvious, because liberalism disguises its own violence through its weaponization of gender equality, etc., as opposed to it merely being because liberals are in power.
Can you unmute me? Okay, there you go. Thank you very much. Thank you for the question, Anna. Yeah, I can talk a bit more on that. So I think that one easy way to kind of think about liberal Islamophobia is to think about the countries which have enacted veil bans, right? So if you look at Canada, in Quebec, you have the introduction of a veil ban. Canada is supposed to be one of the most progressive countries in the world, right? Canada has its own anti-Muslim massacres that have took place in recent years. Canada has a very serious problem with Islamophobia in various respects. There's lots of local activists campaigning against Islamophobia, against state Islamophobia in Canada as well. And that's in relation to being on the no-fly list. So again, there's this idea that only US Muslims are on no-fly lists. No, lots of Canadians are also on no-fly lists, right? And they also kind of face that persecution of not being able to travel anywhere because they've been designated as a possible terrorist. What's interesting here is that we also have the veil ban introduced in a number of, I can't actually keep up with the number of countries. I've got this in a slide because I do a lecture on gender and Islamophobia, and we go through the countries in Europe, but of course France, Austria, I think as well, a number of other countries, maybe Switzerland, I'm not sure, I might have made that up, but it might be accurate, I don't know, but a quick Google will kind of tell you which countries have enacted a veil ban, right? So lots of governments, lots of quite liberal governments as well, right? You know, who would kind of regard themselves as liberal states, as liberal politicians, have been at the forefront of this. People say, and I think this is a really good comparison, right? People say, if Britain's so racist, then why don't we have the veil ban? Why don't we have the hijab ban? And I think this is a really interesting question that we should confront, right? And I think that one of the reasons is that we've had a much better and more organized anti-racist strategy and grassroots organizing over decades, right? Where the left, has had huge issues over the time, particularly in France, right? You know, where much of the organized left in France is deeply Islamophobic. I remember back in the Stop the War days when there were all the protests around Iraq, and Salma Yaqub, who is the well-known Stop the War activist, she was shouted at by a French feminist because she was sat on the same panel as Salma. You know, it was an anti-war thing, and she was screaming at her because she was wearing a hijab. So, this is kind of one aspect to highlight, but then also another one is to say that don't count your chickens, right? Yes, we don't have a hijab ban now, but there's nothing to stop future extreme governments from trying to introduce it, right? I mean, we live in very uncertain political times. I don't think anyone could have predicted what's happened in the world over the past 10 years, you know, in terms of Brexit, in terms of Trump, in terms of what's happening right now, right? You know, this whole crisis that people are living through at this very moment, what's happening in Ukraine, none of this could be predicted. And the only reason this hasn't taken further hold is because there's been a committed network of anti-racists that have successfully challenged and protested Islamophobia. And that's not to say that things can't get worse, but I think that is the major difference there, right? I mean, if you take the grooming example, right? Who was one of the key figureheads around that? It was Sarah Champion, right? You know, she was the shadow minister for women and equalities at the same time that she wrote the article for The Sun, where she said Pakistan is a rapist, right? You know, that was a really anti-Muslim Islamophobic article, but she was the minister that, she was the then shadow minister for women and equalities, right? You know, she's a noted feminist. She describes herself as liberal. You know, she's on the left in terms of being in the Labour Party, but she was a key figurehead in this, right? So I think it's important to kind of see where these voices are and what they campaign for, and I think it's really dangerous because I think that the end result is that this argument or this debate or this form of Islamophobia is weaponized, and ultimately this kind of ends up in far-right massacres. Because even Anders Breivik, so this is an article by Leeds Beckett for Race and Class, but he wrote in his manifesto how many hordes of European women must be raped by Muslim men before we learn, right? You know, so this was at the forefront of his far-right narrative as well. Yeah. So I think there's a number of reasons why we have to be attuned to far-right, why we have to be attuned to liberal Islamophobia, because quite often it's provoked far-right Islamophobia. I hope that answers your question.
I think so. It's my colleague here, and she asked a great question. She's nodding away, so thank you very much for that, Waqas. Did you want to make any points around that as well? If not, we can ask plenty of other questions to ask you. After you.
Yeah, you've unmuted me to be great. Thank you. Yeah, the only thing that I would kind of add on is particularly it does concern immigration, but it is also about what we can do and perhaps where the trajectory is going, particularly around things like hijab bans and whether or not that's possible in the UK. One of the main reasons that it is currently not possible in the UK is because we have the Human Rights Act and because we are party to the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, the reason France could institute hijab bans is because under the European Convention, different states are allowed certain latitude to allow rights to fit in with their cultural identities. And obviously France has always had a very, very strong emphasis on laïcité, and it's obviously part of their national identity. So they were able to argue that laïcité and their need to have a cohesive society kind of trumped the need to protect the right to wear hijab. And that is ultimately why the European Court allows France to do it. Britain does not have that, because we've always had a culture of multiculturalism. We could not use that argument. However, because the government is now trying to overhaul the Human Rights Act, one of the main things the British Bill of Rights is going to do is make it much harder for people to challenge human rights abuses in domestic courts. Now, if you cannot challenge it in a domestic court, you will have no other choice than to go to the European Court. And the European Court in Strasbourg back in 1998, it was estimated to cost around £30,000 and to take approximately 5 years. So the most vulnerable people in society simply won't be able to do that. You can't afford to do that when your rights are being abused. So if we lose that part of the Human Rights Act, then that does become a huge possibility, because obviously people are not going to be able to challenge it, but also there is talk about pulling out of the European Convention in its entirety. So I would thoroughly recommend that everyone watches this space on where the UK's human rights framework is currently situated, and please do fight these changes as much as possible, because this is just one area. Yeah, that's all I'd add.
Thank you, Izzy. Are you able to actually, as we're on Human Rights Act, are you able to kind of go a little bit more in depth in some of the other areas that could be affected if the Human Rights Act is scrapped, or if this new bill that's being proposed is brought in?
Yeah, so that, I mean, there's a number of areas, and I can put, we've got a full briefing on our website that I can pop the link into in the chat. But for example, around deportations, so one of the main changes is that quite often people are able to challenge deportation orders under Article 8 rights. Article 8 is the right to family life. And quite often, if you've got family in the UK, if parents are going to be separated from their children, etc., that is one way that you can fight deportation orders. Now, the Bill of Rights, as it currently stands, it could come back in another form when it's finally tabled again. It will remove the right to challenge deportation orders under Article 8. There are certain provisions which makes it sound like it is still possible, but in reality, the threshold is so very, very, very high that it's not really possible anymore. So they're effectively removing that ability. The other thing that they're doing is, in terms of appealing deportation orders, it's going to do things like requiring the court to accept the Secretary of State's assurances. So, for example, if the Home Secretary says that a country is safe to be returned to, then the court has to accept it, despite the fact that recent months have shown that the Home Secretary is far from infallible when it comes to being accurate with the truth in these types of cases. There are other ways that it is going to seriously hinder kind of the broader, people's broader access to human rights. So for example, positive obligations. So currently the state has a responsibility to actively protect your human rights, not just passively step in when they're being abused, but actively protect them. So for example, if you are in a hospital, if there is somebody that is undergoing a kind of a psychiatric treatment, that the hospital and the welfare team has a responsibility to make sure that that person is not a danger to themselves or others before they can discharge that person. That's one example. Another example is that a social worker must communicate with schools, and teachers must communicate with social workers if they believe that a child their welfare is in danger. The government is removing social obligations, and it is not being clear on how far they're willing to go. So it could be all of those types of obligations for the state to protect its citizens are going to go. The police perhaps won't be obligated to investigate crime fully. There are cases where there was one case of a Muslim man in prison who had been he'd been murdered by a racist cellmate, and the police knew obviously the police and the prison guards, they knew that this guy was racist, and they knew that he was dangerous and violent, and obviously he killed his cellmate. The Human Rights Act was what enabled the family to make there be an inquest into the failings in that case. That would not be possible anymore. So there is a number of ways that the Human Rights Act is being overhauled. So again, I'll put the full briefing in the chat, but it is a concern for everybody.
Thank you so much, Isobel. And yeah, it really is very concerning for everybody, especially, you know, basic things that we consider to be a basic right, like a right to a family life, could be removed. Waqas, can I bring you in on this as well, please?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Isobel. I just had a question for you, actually, if that's okay. I just wanted to ask for some clarity on something. So you mentioned a few minutes ago around the Human Rights Act and how that might prevent any hijab ban in the future here. And I just wanted to interrogate that further, because I'm not so sure. And the reason is because if I was to ask you the question, were Shamima Begum's human rights respected? And you mentioned the war on terror, and we all are familiar with what's happened in the war on terror, where the British have overseen torture of British suspects, the killing of British suspects, you know, by drone strikes, for instance. All of this has happened. Lots of war crimes have happened, but that's despite Britain having a Human Rights Act, right? So I firmly believe that it's important, right, and that we need the Human Rights Act, that it should be defended. But then also, I think that there's a danger that we perhaps overly rely on it, and I don't believe that that itself will be any barrier to any future prevention to try and institute a hijab ban. So I just wanted your thoughts on that, because I believe that quite often for the state, they can be very flexible in terms of whether or not they respect human rights, and I would argue that Shamima Begum's human rights have been respected at all. So if you could just expand on that, please.
Yeah, of course. I know you're absolutely right. Shamima Begum's rights, and within the war on terror, no, human rights have not been respected at all. And part of the reason that the government has been able to do that is because the European Convention does allow states to, it's called derogation. So it can basically say, we are aware that there are conflicts with human rights in these situations and within these pieces of legislation, but because there is an overriding threat to it can be to public health, to public security. So we also saw it within COVID as well, that certain human rights were derogated from for a specific time because they are seen as it. So in terms of Shamima Begum and anything to do with terrorism, quite often the government will simply say, yes, we are aware and we're derogating. Even when Parliament is passing legislation, currently, the minister in charge for passing that legislation has to make a note that it is compatible with human rights. And if it is not compatible with human rights, it simply has to say, we are aware that it is not compatible with human rights, but we are using the sovereignty of Parliament to pass it anyway, because ultimately Parliament has to have the ability to pass its own legislation. And that is why there are, particularly when it comes to counter-terror, there's these arguments that the Human Rights Act has hindered the government and its security, when actually it hasn't, because you're right, they can pretty much just do it anyway. So I'm not saying that it would completely stop, but it does act as a vital mechanism for us. And as you were saying, we do have a very, very strong anti-racism kind of current in an organisation in the UK. We do have mechanisms to fight it, and the Human Rights Act is one of our mechanisms, as is the Equality Act 1998, and obviously the need to have due regard for protected characteristics. So you're completely right, it's not impossible. They could still do it, but we do have certain protections at the moment. So my argument is more that we should be protecting these arguments as much as we possibly can.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. So I have a question for both, if unless someone else would like to ask one from the audience, just sort of check in. I would like to ask about, I mean, Waqas, you mentioned Quilliam Foundation, which is like a think tank that I didn't realize it ceases to exist, which is a great thing, I have to say. But I was wondering, and also Izzy, a question to basically, what other Islamophobic think tanks do you think are out there and influencing these policies? I mean, we do have some, like the Henry Jackson Society, also now talking about immigration, and whether that again is manifesting itself to the way to this direction where we are, we're at the Nationality and Borders Act and so on.
Thank you for the question. I think how much time have we got, I think, is the answer. So there's a lot of think tanks in the UK, in the United States in particular, and actually what's interesting about the ones in the UK is that they are often funded by the US, right? So they're often funded by US billionaires. So I forget the name of the individual or family that was behind Quilliam, but they received millions of pounds, right? So if you think that, if you work in the charity landscape, if you look at your charity, right, I'm pretty sure that you don't have millions of pounds from a donor in the United States, right? So there's all these charities who are very small in the UK, they punch above their weight, they do lots of amazing work on a shoestring, and they have hardly any funders, right? Whereas if your job and if your work is in promoting Islamophobia, that can bring you millions of pounds in funding, right? Because it's lucrative, because there's a huge number of donors waiting to fill your coffers. And I think this is what happened with Quilliam, right? Where they employed some of the most useless people that you can imagine, right? Who produced the most shocking reports. If you take the grooming one, for instance, right? I mean, what was really interesting is that one of the authors of that report, she actually sued Quilliam for some employment. I think that they didn't pay her or something. So then later we found out that she sued them in court, and we saw some legal documents about that. But yeah, it's just a total sham of an organization where they took millions of pounds, but they didn't even pay their own staff properly, who were promoting Islamophobia, right? So that's how much of a shocking organization it was. So yeah, there is the Henry Jackson Society, and yeah, they kind of established themselves as the key source for the right-wing media in the UK. So if there's any incident connected to extremism and terrorism, they would be the go-to. What's really interesting is that with the unrest in Leicester, yes, there have been camps in terms of how people view the violence, etc., and how they interpret it, but they've gone on this real agenda, which has kind of presented it as one of Muslim extremism, right? And it's just totally unhinged, right? Because nobody is making the argument. Absolutely nobody was making the argument that the events in Leicester are connected to Islamists or Muslim extremists in any way, apart from the Henry Jackson Society. So we have to ask questions about why is it them and only them that are seeking to make this narrative, right? And quite often it's connected to their funding and to their previous work as well, which has really been to highlight repeatedly how Britain has a major problem with Muslim extremism, right? And they have repeated demands for more draconian legislation to tackle, and policing to kind of tackle this in their view. And I think that real questions have to be asked, and I think that is partly a failure of journalism, because quite often journalists, and this isn't isolated, I think, just to this issue, right? So even on things like climate change, etc., even on things like the economy, quite often the BBC and other news outlets, they don't bother to report that who the funder is of this organization, even where they are represented politically. But quite often, if it's somebody on the left, they'll always say, this left-wing think tank, but they will hardly ever say that for any right-wing think tank. But yeah, so I think that there needs to be much more scrutiny of the likes of Henry Jackson Society. They seem to be more prominent now. I'm not sure if they got some new funding recently, but they seem to be doing a bit more rounds than they used to. But it's certainly something to keep an eye on, because again, they do a lot of destructive work in that civil society space, and I'm sure that Izzy's got something to say on this as well. But yeah.
Thank you, Waqas. Yeah, I think whenever you mention these kind of think tanks, Henry Jackson Society, Policy Exchange, to any academics, our gloves come off. Not supportive of their work at all. I think they are very, very dangerous. I think they're particularly dangerous because of the connections that they have to the government. I mean, just yesterday I found out that the new Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, actually hosted a Henry Jackson Society event. I think it was the 2014 review of terrorism or something like that. But you can see that the connections are very, very embedded, to the point that someone like William Shawcross, who many of you may have heard of the Shawcross Review, currently running a review on Prevent, has always said very problematic things about Muslim communities, was a few years ago was the charity commissioner who launched a load of investigations into Muslim charities. And then before that was a director at Henry Jackson Society or Policy Exchange. And it's almost incestuous the way that figures from within these think tanks move into these kind of supposedly independent positions. You know, Robin Simcox is another one. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to turn this event into entirely bashing those type of think tanks, but they are very, very dangerous, and they do set the course for much of the government policy in these areas.
Thank you, Zee. And I'm kind of horrified that Suella Braverman, our new Home Secretary, who is already saying that she's going to be tougher than Priti Patel on immigration, is hosting these kind of right-wing Islamophobic think tanks. It's quite worrying. One thing I was going to ask, and then maybe, you know, appreciate if you kind of Izzy and Waqas, you can't answer it, but might call on Lindsay to speak. One thing that's really interesting is I have a friend who's a clinical psychologist, and she's working with refugees in London, and she said, you can quote me on this, that basically a lot of the clients that she has, refugees she's working with, their PTSD is being exacerbated because of the favourable treatment of Ukrainians by the government, the media, our society. You can see all the blue and yellow flags up, and I have no issue with Ukrainians being given refuge in the UK, but obviously it rams home the racism that is apparent, because those same schemes were not and have not been available for Afghans, have not been available for Syrians, and it just kind of adds fuel to the fire for these people who are facing this trauma, and it just adds another layer of, wait, you're still not welcome. The last thing I was going to say was, interestingly, around the Nationality and Borders Act, I was looking at the Equality Impact Assessment today, and it states in there that the top 5 nationalities that are arriving by boats are Iraqis, Iranians, Syrians, Sudanese, and Afghans. And apart from colonialism, the only other thing they have in common is conflict and being a Muslim majority country. And it really made me then reflect exactly who is it that they're trying to kind of, again, penalize and criminalize through these other routes, right? You use immigration as your other route if the criminal justice system doesn't work for you. So Lindsay or Izzy Waqas, please, jump in. I appreciate, sorry, we do have someone who wants to ask a question as well, and I will take that as soon as, apologies, as Lindsay's jumped in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. The thing is that the UK, obviously, immigration system is set up to be as hostile as humanly possible. And people going through that system have reported that actually their PTSD and their trauma has intensified simply by going through that system, when quite often people are already having trauma from what they've fled in their countries of origin and what they've had to face there. Then on top of that, when an individual's having to face Islamophobia, that inevitably is increasing the trauma that they are or have gone through. And that's something I think that's often not taken into account, is the trauma which is actually put on people through going through Islamophobia here in the UK. Because as we saw in a report, now I'm going to talk about Scottish statistics for a minute, so please forgive me, folks. But the CPG, that's the cross-party group on Islamophobia in Scotland, they reported that 89.4% of all Muslims in Scotland had faced Islamophobia, with 60% or just over 60% having faced that on a daily basis. Now imagine every single day of your life facing some kind of abuse, and many people actually reported that they changed their behavior because of abuse. So imagine that on top of going through the immigration system, and then on top of the trauma that you have had to flee from your country of origin. People are simply being traumatized and re-traumatized, going through a system here which is supposed to be a system that's supposed to be there to protect some of our most vulnerable in society. And I think that's something that's really not taken into account in many cases, and especially for those working within the immigration system. the fact that many people are facing Islamophobia on a daily basis does need to be considered. I mean, that and racism, and quite often when you are like a Muslim woman, especially if you are an ethnic minority Muslim woman, you're facing the three-pronged attack of being ethnic minority, being Muslim, and being a woman. So these things all need to be taken into consideration when we are supporting those who are going through any kind of system within the UK. But I'm going to go to Deb now. Deb, great, thank you so much for your patience. Slightly concerned about asking anybody to unmute or on camera, but I see your beautiful little cat in picture, so I'm hoping that everything's okay here. If you just want to ask your question, that would be lovely. Thank you, Deb.
Oh, you can't hardly see me, can you? Sorry. No, I was interested, very interested, because where I live, obviously, I am in a predominantly Muslim area, so I don't see the problems, if you know what I mean, because it's, to me, people are people, and we don't have any issues. Well, we have recently, obviously. It was only around the corner from me that we had that trouble. That was one of the questions I did want to ask about what you thought about all that. My camera's rubbish or my chair's too low, I don't know which. I've forgotten what else I was going to ask and say now. But yeah, another thing as well that Waqas said about, because where I live and I'm close to Highfield, so when I was really young, and that was a lot of the Black community were there, so society and parents obviously were telling us you've got to be fearful. So I can see, you know, where you were coming from with that, and now it's changed, completely changed over. And I can't remember what else I was going to ask. I'm really sorry, it's gone from my head.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, I mean, that is an important thing to be considering, obviously, what's happening in certain areas in the UK right now. It is something that does need to be considered. And I know it's kind of off topic of what we've been looking at. But if one of our, or both of our panelists would like to comment on what's happening in Leicester just now, then I would, I'm sure Deb would be very grateful for that. Is it?
Well, I mean, I'm not a huge expert in this area, but what I will say very briefly is that the media reports are not necessarily something that people should be following, because there is a lot more going on underneath the surface. Communities have lived together very, very harmoniously for decades. But the one narrative that I do specifically want to dispel is that people like Tommy Robinson have been going around promoting this narrative that this is all because of, you know, Muslim extremism. I don't like the word extremism, but inverted commas, extremism, fundamentalism, and all these type of noxious terms. It is much more to do with a political undercurrent there. So if we look at what's going on in India, the current Modi in India, he's been promoting a very specific form of what's called Hindutva nationalism, which is essentially kind of Hindu superiority, which is drawn through this political need to expel Muslims from India. We've seen mosques being bulldozed, we've seen people being lynched, we've seen all sorts going on in India, and I'm currently working closely with some of the organisations in India that are very, very concerned. They're talking about fears of being on the verge of genocide. But then ahead of recent elections, we've also seen kind of some of that kind of political narrative being shipped over to the UK, and there were leaflets going around telling in predominantly, you know, Hindu neighborhoods, telling people don't vote for Labour because they support Muslims, and it's become very, very politicized, spreading that propaganda in the UK. And quite often, the same as what's been happening in India and also in China, the reason given for this hostility towards Muslims is because they are supposedly all terrorists, all a threat, etc. So I would just say be very, very careful when those narratives are going around about it being all about Muslim aggression. It's not. There is a lot of external political influence coming in to these local areas. And there's also a lot of agitators like Tommy Robinson that are purposefully stirring up more hatred when there are a lot of groups and communities on the ground that very much would just like this to end harmoniously and to work together, and to come to some kind of amicable settlement, I suppose. So that's all I'll really say on that.
Thank you so much for that, Isobel. And I think that's something that's important to remember when we're talking about any of these issues, is that it has been seen in research that for every one moderate mention of Muslims in the mainstream media, there are 21 negative mentions or extremist mentions of Muslims. And so when Isobel is highlighting that need to kind of have caution around the media, then we have to remember that when the media is reporting on anything, because unfortunately it can be very biased towards the Muslim community. So thank you for highlighting that. And can I bring yourself in there, Waqas?
Yeah. So I think that Isobel covered that quite well. In terms of what I'd add, I would say that, that there's certainly a lot of agitators who kind of want to see more disharmony. They want to stir it up further. And I think it's good to see that things have settled down, and I hope it stays that way, and I hope it does stay calm, and I hope that the communities do stay harmonious. It seems to me, and I think, like any social scientist, I think that this does need a lot more research, because I think one of the things, and again, this is something that Isobel mentioned around social media and around rumor and misinformation, it can be harmful in many respects. And so I think it's important to kind of bear that in mind. But I think it's pretty clear that much of this has been provoked by elements of the Hindutva far right, who have infiltrated, who went on an armed incursion into a less than Muslim community, and that's unprecedented, really, right? And the point that I made on Twitter was that if this was Muslims that did this, right, it would be perceived very differently, okay? So I'm glad that things have settled down, and I don't think I have too much to add apart from the fact that, yes, I think it does need a lot more research in terms of what exactly happened, because it's still not clear who exactly the agitators were. In terms of those men, I think there was a couple of hundred men. I think that there's still a lack of detail as to where they came from exactly, but it does seem to be organized. And I think that is the worrying part, right? Where if an organized group of armed men wearing balaclavas have gone into a religious community, I think that sends a bad signal for everyone, not just Muslim communities, right? It sets a really worrying precedent for what can happen if things are allowed to kind of spiral out of control. But as I said, I'm just glad that things for now seem to have settled down.
Thank you so much, Deb. I'm really sorry, but unfortunately we are coming to the end of our session. And sorry, you're muted. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Deb is saying thank you so much for your answers. Thank you for that, Deb. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our session. So what I would like to do is ask our panel if they would give just a very kind of short 1 minute roundup of any kind of closing thoughts or comments. Yeah, so who would like to go first? Izzy, you're unmuted. If you want to go first, that would be grand, and then Waqas can have the final words there as well.
Okay, so I guess I would just say that in terms of working in this field, firstly, I think it's very, very important to make sure that your work is being contextualized within the wider environment. I mean, obviously, I've talked today about citizenship, the war on terror, the Bill of Rights, the Nationality and Borders Bill. So I think in any field, actually, working within anti-racism, you have to keep an eye on the ball across all different areas and all different areas of policy. But also, when it comes to actually providing tangible support to refugees on the ground, there needs to be this constant understanding of the various different intersectional experiences, because we've been talking about Islamophobia today, but what we haven't really spoken about is things like gendered Islamophobia, or, for example, the way that different ethnicities can experience Islamophobia, or revert Islamophobia, experiencing it from within their own their original community and trying to enter their new community. We've not talked about things like the experiences of minority sects within Islam, so Shias, for example. So you do, as it goes without saying, in any kind of anti-racism project, we do need to think about these intersectional and kind of compounding experiences that are going to create barriers for people, and we need to be cognizant of that when we're trying to create strategies to help them and to platform those experiences.
Thank you so much. And Waqas, can I hand over to you for your kind of final thoughts?
Okay, yeah. I think that on the one hand, it's really great to focus on and centre Islamophobia, because it's really important. It's something that we're all passionate about in terms of trying to prevent it, in terms of trying to make life better in Britain and elsewhere for Muslims. But I think it's also important to think that we should expand our anti-racism as much as possible and look at the commonalities in terms of what's happening. But much of this, and I think that one of the ways to think about it is intersectional, but also to think about how much of our experience is shared by other communities in different ways, and even in overlapping ways. So if you think, for instance, around the Windrush scandal, what's happening there, if you think about the fact that a number of people who are being persecuted are, of course, not Muslim as well. So I think that it's important to kind of focus on having a wider understanding of anti-racism, and I don't think it's helpful to collapse it solely into anti-Islamophobia, because yes, that is doing something and is doing something laudable and valuable, but I think that it needs to do a bit more as well. And I think that we're much more united if we challenge various racisms, all racisms, right? So I think it's really important to bear that in mind. I think it's also important to get involved. There's lots of groups here that are represented tonight. People can get involved, right? There's MEND, there's Migrant Rights Network, there's Izzy's Community Policy Forum. Is that right? Have I pronounced it correctly? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so there's lots of ways to get involved, right? Have a conversation. Particularly, if you're a student, you can get involved on campuses, etc. But I think it's important to bear in mind that everyone can do something, right? Because there's this idea that I'm powerless, I'm disconnected from politics, I don't have a say. Everyone can do something, right? And I think that it's also important to be attuned to when something happens. So I'm just thinking of last year or the year before, when there were those awful clampdowns on students protesting for Palestine, right, in schools, right? And a number were referred to prevent. It was really awful time for many Muslim communities, for many Muslim students, and for many Muslim families and parents, right? And I think it's moments like that where you have to get active, right? Where you have to have some involvement at the local level, at the community level, right? Where you have to do things, which may sound like they're not important, like writing to your MP, writing to your school, writing to the newspaper, right? But I think that we all have to kind of raise our voices, because in the times that we live in these very dangerous times, in these times where governments often need scapegoats, right? If you learn just one thing from the likes of Stuart Hall or Sivanandan, is that in moments of crisis, the government and the powerful look for scapegoats, right? So we're now in a huge crisis, and don't be surprised, where if there's an attempt to scapegoat minorities and Muslims in particular ways, and we have to be attuned to that, and we have to resist that.
Thank you so much for that. Those are really valid points. And yeah, of course, tackling one form of hate is about tackling all forms of hate. And it's really important that we do that collectively. Obviously, I do work for an organisation that tackles Islamophobia. So I just want to highlight that there is training available through MEND and other organisations. But MEND, you can see in our website that there is lots of different training sessions there, including things like active bystander and also causes and cures. So what is Islamophobia and how can we work together to tackle it? It's also Islamophobia Awareness Month, which is coming up really soon, and MEND is obviously a massive supporter and partner within Islamophobia Awareness Month. It's in November. So I do encourage all organisations to get active, whether that's just doing a little bit on social media or hosting your own event on different topics around Islamophobia to help start those conversations. And it's important to do that in all organisations, to have those conversations around Islamophobia, and they can lead on to lots of other conversations about how we tackle hate in a really kind of joined up and cohesive way. So from me, thank you so much. And I will now pass over to my co-host who really put together this programme this evening for the final words. So thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie, and thank you, Izzy and Waqas. I mean, you kind of left us on kind of a point moment, because I'm going to also do a plug. So obviously the Who is Welcome series is about an intersectional approach and discussion to immigration and other issues, and so we'd love you to join. My colleague is dropping kind of a link to where you can find out about previous events we've run, but also we'd love you to join us at future ones as well, where we are going to look at, again, some overlooked issues like masculinity and migration, and you might see Izzy back again for that one. As that's her, kind of another subject matter she's an expert on. But we want to, I think it's really important, as you said, it is about looking things jointly, it's about looking at the commonalities. And also, importantly for us, it's really about making sure that our language is evolving. So we've also created a series called Words Matter, which is really trying to unpick some of the harmful narratives that are present still in the sector, still in our media, still used by politicians, such as the language of illegals. And we've dissected those and explained what is better to use, so that we aren't demonizing and harming migrants when we're using these when language around them. But we will also be kind of sending a link round with the recording. There might be some slight editing with some of the issue earlier, but please do share that amongst your networks. I think what what Izzy and Waqas have shared today is really important. It needs to be heard and seen much wider, and I think, again, the idea of and the issue around Islamophobia within kind of immigration really needs to be better understood by the migrant refugee sector, especially, so that they can, as Izzy said, better support the people that they're serving, and we can make sure that the immigration policies that are coming forward aren't discriminatory against certain groups. So I just want to, thank you again for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Apologies if you didn't get to answer a follow-up question, or you didn't feel able to ask a question. If you wanted to get in contact with us, I hope Waqas and Izzy will be okay if we can signpost on questions where people said, I've had reflected and wanted to ask something. But again, just final thank you from me and Lindsay, and a thank you again to Izzy and Waqas.